Hello, I would like to thank Family Access for providing me an opportunity to speak with you all about some of the research and work I've been doing in the area of parental alienation. My name is Dr. Jennifer Harman, and I'm an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University. Now, if you're not familiar with me, my PhD is in the area of social psychology, which is a different subdiscipline of psychology than clinical or counseling psychology, which most people think of when they hear the word psychology. There are many other disciplines of psychology other than clinical psychology, and you can see many of them here. My approach as a social psychologist is to use different methods to understand how a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are affected by others. Most of my talk today is focused on research and the challenges associated with it, because that's what I do. I will not be focusing on strategies for coping with parental alienation, which I will leave for others to do in their presentations. My talk will focus on two topics over the course of the next hour. First, I will discuss some terminology used in aggression and violence literature, and then review the scientific evidence regarding the parallels between parental alienating behaviors and one specific type of intimate partner violence, coercive control. We don't have a lot of time for me to fully describe all the studies that I'm going to talk about, and I know that you may not have the scientific training to understand a lot of the details that I would like to provide. Throughout my talk, I do provide citations for the original research that I'm describing, and I will provide a way to contact me at the end of the talk if you would like the full references or articles that I'm talking about. You will notice in the description of my talk that I'm also going to focus on what's been communicated as a controversy in the field. And I'm going to explain later why I have that word in quotation marks. But given how much misinformation is spread about parental alienation and how the scientific work on this topic has been minimized and misrepresented, I'm going to describe how science denial has been affecting the public perception and progress in this area. And then I'm going to give you my opinion on where the root of this science denial is coming from. Now, the definitions used by social scientists to study and understand different forms of aggression and violence are not always the same as that used in the legal profession. Science is always evolving, and the law takes a bit longer to reflect that knowledge. There are many ways that aggression, violence, and abuse have been classified, not just physical abuse. We were talking about legal abuses, psychological abuse, the creation of fear, neglect, financial abuse, sexual aggression and harassment, emotional and spiritual abuse. This can be abuse towards adults and children. Family violence is a broad term that captures patterns of abusive behaviors in intimate or family relationships. We're not talking about intergroup violence or workplace violence when we use this term. The term domestic violence has sometimes been used interchangeably with family violence, but more commonly it refers to intimate partner violence. And there's been growing evidence that there's different types and forms of intimate partner violence. The first one being what's sometimes been called battery or intimate terrorism. Today, the more commonly used term is coercively controlling abuse or coercively controlling violence. The other form has been called situational couple violence or common couple violence. We're going to get back to these two forms later. Almost 3 years ago, I co-authored a peer-reviewed paper that was published in one of the top psychology journals in the world, Psychological Bulletin. It's a journal published by the American Psychological Association. We reviewed the published literature on parental alienation, and we showed how the behaviors that are used to influence a child's rejection of a parent for reasons that are not legitimate meet the definition of family violence, both child abuse and intimate partner violence. Now, that's too much for me to tackle here today. The focus of the first part of my talk is going to be on one piece of this, coercively controlling abuse. It's my scientific opinion that this is just a different word for parental alienating behaviors. They are one and the same thing. Now, over the last decade, I have seen parental alienation occur in some relationships very close to me, to both mothers and fathers. And this is what has motivated me to better understand the problem. And I saw early on that most people talked about how parental alienating behaviors are a form of child abuse and maltreatment. And while I agreed with that, I believed it was more than just child abuse. Because in my interviews with alienated mothers and fathers, it became really clear to me that this was family violence. It wasn't only child abuse, but also intimate partner violence against the targeted parent. Now, one mother I interviewed described being a victim of severe physical abuse before leaving her ex-husband, at which point her child had been weaponized against her. And she said to me, "I love my daughter, but how do I keep loving a weapon? At what point will it hurt me too much?" This statement stayed with me and helped me to draw parallels in the two lines of research on coercively controlling abuse and parental alienating behaviors. My colleagues and I are not saying that family violence is just an analogy, as one critic of our work has claimed. It's not an analogy. Coercively controlling abuse and parental alienating behaviors are the same things, and we just use different names for them. Let me show you some of the reasons why this is the case. There are many different definitions of coercively controlling abuse. I provide one here from Women's Aid in the United Kingdom. It says it's an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation, or other abuse that's used to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. So it creates these invisible chains and a sense of fear that permeates all parts of that person's life. Now, the types of behaviors that coercively controlling abusers use has been studied for many years by clinicians and scientists. And they're actually elegantly depicted by the Duluth model's power and control wheel. You can see the wheel is based on beliefs that domestic violence is gender-based violence, which is something we're going to come back to later. But what I want to focus on in this wheel is the use of children, which says it's making the other parent feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass the parent, or threatening to take the child away. Now, the use of children as weapons by abusive men in heterosexual relationships has been shown by a lot of scholars. A handful of them are listed here. This research has shown that abusive fathers have dragged out custody battles and used parenting visitation to continue to harass mothers. They've threatened to abduct or harm their children if the mothers don't comply with what they want. And the children are manipulated to spy on the mother on behalf of the abusive father. Many women report that fathers have attempted to turn their children against them. Likewise, male victims of intimate partner violence describe the same things. Research has shown that abusive mothers tell the children lies about the fathers. They undermine their authority and call them names in front of the children. They tell them that they will take their children away and threaten that they will never see them again. They use the children for their personal gain, don't let them see their kids, and made false allegations of abuse after they left the relationship in order to punish them and prevent them from seeing their children. So abusive fathers and mothers have used their children as weapons as part of a larger strategy to harm the other parent. But here's where a lot of domestic violence research stops short. The lingering question is how this affects children to be used as a weapon. How does weaponization affect the child's attitudes towards the parent that they're weaponized against? How do they respond to that situation? Well, there has been decades of research looking at this by scientists who've just been calling this weaponization something else. We have been calling it parental alienating behaviors. Now, here's a simplified version of the Duluth model's power and control wheel that I presented earlier that depicts coercively controlling behaviors. In a book chapter I published last year with Dr. Mandy Mathewson, we reviewed parental alienating behaviors detailed by clinicians and scientists in their work. Our review was very easy to do. The behaviors mapped onto this power and control wheel perfectly. And I refer you to the book that you see at the bottom of the screen for more details. Abusive behaviors are not the only similarities. Perpetrators of these forms of abuse have a lot of similar characteristics. These are just a sample of citations that have documented these characteristics in the two respective fields of study. In other words, I have not cherry-picked these studies out of groups of other studies that don't show these relationships. These studies are shown here to just illustrate what other studies have also found. The perpetrators of both of these types of abuse have pathologies like narcissism and other personality disorders. They often have unresolved trauma from their past, and they're motivated to obtain and gain control over the targets of their behaviors. We also can look at the child's attitudes and behaviors towards the abusive and alienating parents to see other parallels. Several studies have found that most children who've been severely abused or maltreated by a parent don't often reject them. Rather, abused children engage in protective behaviors towards them because they long for their continued love and affection. For example, children in foster care often express a desire to return home to their abusive parent. They blame themselves for their abuse, and they minimize how bad the abuse has been. They want the parent to stop, and they still see the good in them, despite the bad behavior. So even though it would make sense for severely alienated children or abused children to reject their abusive parent due to the harm that they've caused them, they usually don't. They still love them, and they want them to get better. They're open to a relationship with them when they're assured that that parent is safer or sober or in a more stable place. Now, when we look at alienated children's relationships with the alienating parent, we see similar behaviors. There are too many studies for me to cite here that show how alienated children provide reflexive support for the alienating parent. The alienated child makes excuses for their abusive behaviors. They deny that the parent had been manipulating or pressuring them, and they minimize the alienating parent's actions to others. Now, it may look like they're very close to this abusive parent, but their attachment to them is very insecure and anxious. It's not a healthy one due to their being used as a weapon. Many adults who were alienated as children have said that the parent who also abuse them in other ways, such as physical abuse. This alone should be a red flag as to who the abusive parent is in the family dynamic. We also see parallels in outcomes for both types of victims of abuse. Female and male victims of abuse are often blamed for their victimization. They fear that no one will believe them. Similarly, alienated parents are often blamed for their children's rejection of them. They're not believed, are told that there's no such thing as parental alienation, or that they're told it's just not so bad and their kids will figure it out when they get older. Both alienated parents and victims of coercively controlling abuse experience trauma, anxiety, depression, extreme stress. They have diminished life satisfaction, and they believe that the world is not fair or just. And many of them become suicidal. Mothers who are alienated from their children and who are victims of coercively controlling abuse have struggled with their identification as a parent, which is a central role in identity for many women. And there are other parallels. Let's keep going. There's been controversy in the domestic violence scholarship about whether violence can be reciprocal. When violence is reciprocated, both people are engaging in aggression, and they often have similar levels of power in the relationship. The violence is not very predictable or patterned, and it typically happens when both people can't control their anger very well, or they're unable to manage their conflict in less aggressive ways. And so in this case, people involved in this conflict largely react to each other. And this has been called situational couple violence. Now, in contrast, coercively controlling abuse, otherwise known as intimate terrorism or battery, involves more unilateral use of aggression, where there's one primary perpetrator who tries to gain and maintain power over their victim. And if the other person reciprocates, it's typically out of self-defense. Now, this aggression is more predictable, and we see that it increases at times when the perpetrator starts to feel like they're losing control. Some domestic violence advocates have taken the position that situational couple violence doesn't exist because all violence is gender-based violence. meaning that violence is just used by men to subjugate and control women across human societies. From this perspective, women are supposedly only use aggression in self-defense to protect their children from abusive men. They believe that if mental health and legal professionals think that there's situational or common couple violence going on, that they just don't get it and that they're missing the underlying controlling dynamic of the man. For example, here's an excerpt from a code book that Professor Joan Meyer developed to examine appellate court cases in the United States. I've highlighted in red the key words that point to Meyer's opinion on this issue. She wrote that situational couple violence is a label for domestic violence that purportedly manifests as a product of conflict rather than a product of ongoing controlling dynamic. It is thought to be a product of dysfunctional communication and conflict resolution within the couple. And courts will sometimes distinguish this from coercive domestic violence or intimate terrorism and conclude that it does not rise to the level of true domestic violence. Now, while conducting her research, anytime there's mention of situational couple violence, Meyer's team coded the allegation of abuse as having been discredited by the court because of her belief about violence. Her coding decision reflects a belief that courts are just getting women's allegations of abuse wrong because the only true or real form of abuse is a controlling dynamic used by abusive men against women. Now, there's been considerable research evidence, as well as national statistics, on multiple forms of violence that do not support this position. And this example is one of the many reasons why Professor Meyer's work and conclusions drawn from it have been strongly criticized by scholars and scientists such as myself. Last year, there was a study published by Denise Hines and her colleagues that was funded by the National Institute of Health. They looked at whether reciprocity of abuse does occur and how often men and women engage in both types of abuse. For all forms of abuse, the most common pattern was both partners perpetrating. About half of the people experienced abuse in the last year said it was reciprocal. Now, for severe psychological aggression, controlling behaviors, and physical assault, there were much larger percentages of female-only perpetration than male-only perpetration, 2 to 3 times as many. These statistics directly contradict the very premise of Professor Meyer's position on the nature of violence. The only type of abuse in this study where male-only perpetration was greater than female-only perpetration was nonverbal sexual aggression. Now, if parental alienating behaviors are coercively controlling abuse, do we see the same pattern? I created a pie chart here for the severe psychological abuse based on the data you just saw on the previous slide. You can see that a little over half of participants in the previous study reciprocated behaviors in the last year. Now, in 2019, I published a study looking at people who had a child with someone that they're no longer in a relationship with. And we asked people whether they and their ex had engaged in behaviors that we consider parental alienating behaviors. And surprisingly, a lot of people admitted doing them. And what we found was almost identical to what Hines and her colleagues found. Almost half the parents reported mutual engagement in these behaviors, and the other half reported one-sided perpetration. Some self-admitted to being the primary perpetrators themselves. However, unlike the Hines study, we did not find gender differences in who the victims were. This means that mothers and fathers were just as likely to be perpetrators of these abusive behaviors. So what does this reciprocity tell us about parental alienation behaviors as being a form of family violence? Well, research evidence, including the 2 studies I just described, has shown that about half of family violence cases involve behaviors that are reciprocal in nature, which, as I described earlier, are what is considered situational couple violence. According to some scientific theories about power, you need to have similar levels of power as your partner in order to be able to reciprocate aggression like that. In families where there are loyalty conflicts, research has shown that both parents engage in bad behaviors. Think of the classic film Kramer versus Kramer, where both of the parents are being horrible to each other, and they're putting their child in the middle of it all. Now, in that situation, both the parents need to have relatively the same power and influence over each other in order to reciprocate. And in this situation, the child loves both of their parents, and both of the parents are behaving badly, and they're trying to get their child to pick their side. Now, children in this type of dynamic often disengage. They don't want to be involved in their parents' drama. And this is a very different dynamic than parental alienation, where the child has been influenced to turn entirely on a parent. Now, coercively controlling abuse involves a more powerful partner who uses one-sided, proactive patterns of aggression over time in order to get power. Now, in my 2019 study that I just described, we found that parents who were the primary and unreciprocating target of parental alienating behaviors were more likely to be alienated from their children than parents who reciprocated those behaviors. So in this way, the power dynamics within these families can help us differentiate between different forms of family conflict. This summer, I published results of a study in the scientific journal Personal Relationships. And for this study, I wanted to use another method and sample to more directly look at whether families affected by parental alienation did have these power imbalances. We interviewed parents from around the world who had been alienated from their children, and they described what had happened in their families over time. We found that over 66% of parents described situations in their families where they had little to no power at all. And the alienating parent had nearly all the power and control over them. This is something we call asymmetric dependence. The alienating parent had the allegiance of the children. They had undermined the authority of the alienated parent. They elevated the child to the role of an adult who could choose whether or not to have a relationship with their other parent. And the alienating parent had socially isolated the other parent by turning everybody against them. These are all examples of coercively controlling abuse. Now, many of the parents in our study, both mothers and fathers, reported being the target of severe physical abuse at the hands of the other parent. And they said that they left their relationships in order to escape this abuse, only to be further abused by having their children turned against them. Just as victims of coercively controlling violence and abuse have described in other research studied by domestic violence scientists. We also have found that alienating parents often created or staged confrontations with the other parent in order to try to get more control over them. This is a situation that we call chicken, like the tragic game of two cars on a collision course towards each other. The alienating parent, for example, would force confrontations in public, leaving only two choices for the alienated parent. They could either engage with them and talk with them or try to, or walk away. And this strategy was actually not that surprising to find, because coercively controlling abusers gain control by minimizing choices and options of their victims. So when we found that alienating parents were forcing the other parent to engage in only one of two ways, both designed to make them look bad, this led further a confirmation that this is a form of coercively controlling abuse. So far, we've covered scientific evidence that supports at least 10 ways that parental alienating behaviors are coercively controlling abuse. Some critics have claimed that people who study parental alienation are only looking for support for their pre-existing beliefs. In other words, they claim that scientists are trying to confirm beliefs that they have when they do their research, something that we call confirmation bias. This claim ignores how the scientific research on the topic has been conducted. Scientists have been testing competing theories and different explanations for outcomes using a wide variety of measures, methods, and samples. They've been conducting replication research to see whether the findings in one study can be found again somewhere else. This scientific method is the weapon against confirmation bias. Now, overall, the empirical data consistently points to the same conclusion, that parental alienating behaviors are another word for coercively controlling abuse. They're not just two sides of the same coin. They are the same coin entirely. But no matter how much research evidence accumulates to support this point, I see continued resistance to it. The communication of evidence derived from careful scientific and clinical observations has been labeled just rhetoric by critics of alienation, even though rhetoric and empirical evidence are totally different things. Now, perhaps you've seen this too. All over social media and among some legal and mental health professionals, there's continued denial that parental alienation exists. People keep saying it's just a claim that abusive dads make to get custody of their children. And perhaps you've heard that there's controversy in the area, and so we should not put too much faith in the research on the topic. This is science denial, and it's a serious threat to the well-being of our children and families. So for the second part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on science denial. The diagram you see here illustrates a large number of science denial techniques that have been identified by climate scientists whose research has been also plagued by this problem. Parental alienation research is not unique in this respect at all. I'm working on a few papers right now with some colleagues that document each of these techniques here and more. And I'm only going to touch on a handful of them today to call attention to how they are being used to undermine our confidence in all the science that we have so far. When our confidence is undermined, evidence-based decisions that affect the lives of our families are compromised. One strategy that is used is the creation of controversies. You may have heard of a few of them described in this field, such as the research of the work not being scientific enough, or there's not consensus in terminology, or that the interventions in the field are not evidence-based. And like the mythological creature Hydra, just as scientific research starts to build to address one controversy, another one pops up in its place. No matter how much scientific evidence we add, there's been a corresponding strengthening of the original controversy, followed by another one to bolster the defenses of the unsupported position. Before we get into some more science denial techniques, it'd be useful to get at the root of why critics are using the techniques in the first place. So let's take a step in the Wayback Machine to see what history can teach us. We're going to another time when science was being attacked and undermined in the justice system. It's a time referred to now as the memory wars of the 1980s. And much like today, it involved a debate between practicing therapists, legal professionals, and research psychologists. Now, for a long time, there was a theory about memory that it exists in some sort of mental library, like a literal and accurate recording of past events that we file away in the recesses of our brain. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus has published 24 books and more than 600 papers showing that memories are reconstructed, not replayed. In other words, our memory is always shifting. It's not fixed. It's not preserved in stone or recorded on a computer hard drive, waiting to be accessed with complete accuracy. No one's is. Her research on memory created a paradigm shift in the field. In the courtroom, she described how research showed that if you were being urged to remember something more, such as being asked to recall more about a crime or talk more about an interaction that a child had with a parent, you could produce something like a guess or a thought, and then that can start to feel like a memory. Now, Loftus says if you label something in a particular way, you can distort your memory of it. You can plant entire events into the minds of otherwise ordinary people. Emotions that are expressed as part of a retelling of a memory are no guarantee that you're dealing with an authentic memory. This means that an event that was not traumatic at the time could later be recalled as traumatic later on because of how memories can be easily distorted. Now, Ellen Bass, author of The Courage to Heal and a leader in the recovered memory movement, said that if you think you were abused and your life shows the symptoms, then you were. She described trauma as an extraordinary and idiosyncratic experience that could not be simulated in the lab or even expressed by the rules of science. Recovered memory believers argued that trauma sets up new rules for memory, an opinion that lacked scientific support. You can imagine how Bass and her supporters felt about the memory research that Loftus and other scientists were publishing in psychology journals at the time. The criticisms of Loftus's work seem to suggest that there's only one kind of story that women can tell about sexual abuse, and that it's that their stories are always accurate and true. And scientists who challenged these gender beliefs about violence at the time were attacked. For example, around this time, Dr. Irene Freeze presented evidence at a professional conference for there being reciprocity of violence in heterosexual relationships. Someone in the audience threw a shoe at her. How dare she challenge the prevailing belief that women only use aggression in reaction to patriarchal terrorism? Only men were supposed to be abusers. In the 1980s, women in therapy started uncovering memories from many, many years ago of being sexually abused by their fathers. Loftus could find very little experimental evidence to support the idea that memories of trauma, after remaining dormant for a decade or more, could suddenly come to life. Nobody knew how commonly traumatized people repress their memories or how accurate the memories are. Loftus found that this lack of evidence was very disturbing, particularly because the belief about memory was being used in court to prosecute many fathers for crimes that they likely did not commit. She was worried that therapists, through hypnosis and other suggestive techniques, were coaxing memories into being. As Loftus began testifying on behalf of men who she believed may have been wrongly accused of abuse, she came to be seen as an expert who was supporting rather than challenging institutions of patriarchal power. Loftus came under continued attack from therapists and patients who were convinced that their newfound memories were accurate. Her research on human memory exposed her to death threats, lawsuits, personal abuse, and a campaign to have her fired from her job. Psychology departments across the country started banning her from speaking. Their rationale was that her work, although it was good science, was setting women back. Her scientific work was viewed as being too political, simply because it challenged people's beliefs about violence. Loftus said that whenever you pick or work in an area that challenges people's wrong-headed, cherished beliefs, it can be difficult, but sometimes it could be a matter of life and death. The reason I'm telling you this story about Dr. Loftus is because what happened to her is still happening today, and it's happening to many others who work in this area of parental alienation. Dr. Loftus has found that the memory wars are not over. There are still many practicing clinicians who hold beliefs about the nature of memory that are not empirically supported. I see it among practitioners in many cases that I consult on today. Loftus says that there are still families today that are in a state of destruction because of unsupported accusations of abuse. Some of the repressed memory believers have been active critics of parental alienation scholarship. Critics have claimed that parents cannot influence the memories of children to dislike or hate another parent for perceived wrongdoings that never happened. They've argued that parents can't have that kind of influence over their children. Most scientists would laugh at those types of statements, given how much research evidence we have on social influence and memory. And yet critics' unsupported opinions about memory and parental influence are influencing decisions about children in our courts today. The abuse that Loftus experienced marked a distinct shift away from what normally happens in science, where there's normally a good-natured professional debate about differences in opinion. And that type of shift contributes to science denial. And I'm going to describe a bit here about how this happens. Scientific debate begins after a paper passes a very rigorous peer review process. The person submits a paper for consideration at a good journal, like a scientific journal, and then it's reviewed by the editor and other reviewers who were selected by the editor. This gatekeeping model is designed to prevent bad or low quality research from being published. After the paper is published in the journal, letters can be written to the editor within a limited time period. Usually, I've seen at most about 90 days. Sometimes a person is invited by the editor to write a commentary about some work maybe that was critical of their research. Being invited to write a commentary is no guarantee that the journal will accept it. There are high standards for these commentaries. The editor and the reviewers, again, are important gatekeepers. They decide whether the arguments that are made have scientific merit and that they will provide a valuable contribution to a larger scientific discussion about the topic. The commentaries that don't meet that standard are rejected by the journal, and the authors might even be asked to revise it if they think that there's something that could be adjusted. Then the response is evaluated again, and if it passes, it will be accepted and published in the journal. Then the journal typically asks the original authors to respond to this commentary. The response is evaluated again to see if that response passes scientific standards. And if it does, then it's published. If it's not, it's rejected. And that is it. There's not a perpetual back and forth. If the commentator still disagrees with the original author's opinion or their research and the findings and conclusions of that research, then that person will go out and design their own study. They will collect more data, empirical support for their position. And then the debate continues that way over time. Now, all of this is published in the same place, so the reader can see the arguments for and against, and they can form their own opinion after they've reviewed all the scientifically vetted information. But this has not been happening in the field of parental alienation scholarship. Now, before I get into what's been happening, I need to first explain the difference between scholarly and peer-reviewed or refereed journals. Scholarly journals, sometimes called professional journals, are designed for professionals in a field to distill information on a research that can be useful for them in their work. There might be some peer review of the articles, but the peers are other scholars who decide whether the work is valuable for people in their field. They might publish research, but the selection of the reviewers of the work varies a lot on about the scientific background and their knowledge of the methods and statistics and things that were used by the original researcher. And the journals it's important to mention that these journals have an important place in the field to help generate new ideas and help translate research into practice. But make no mistake that they're not the same as scientific journals. Examples of these type of scholarly journals are Family Court Review. Now, journals that publish peer-reviewed or refereed articles have editors who choose reviewers of papers because they have scientific training and background to critique the value of the work that's been submitted for consideration. These journals often have very high rejection rates because they only publish work that meets very high scientific or scholarly standards. Now, the quality of both of these types of journals varies a lot, which means that the scientific or scholarly merits of the papers that are published in those journals vary a lot as well. So how do we evaluate and compare the quality of these journals? There are several metrics that are used to evaluate different types of journals. You can see a few of these here, and you can find these metrics by looking on the website of the journal that you're interested in. They will usually list them. If they don't list them, it might be that they just don't want you to know what those metrics are. Now, the journal impact factor is something that they calculate every year. And it's the number of times that articles that are published in that journal the previous 2 years are cited by other people that year. So it's essentially like the impact that someone's work in that journal has on other people's work. Now, the CITE score is similar, but it uses 3 years instead of 2 years. And the SJR score is similar to the journal impact factor, but it factors in the fields of science that maybe don't cite the work of others very much, and also the prestige of the journal where the article is published in. Now, there are other metrics, but what's important to remember here is because an article is published in one journal doesn't mean it could have necessarily been published in another journal that has higher standards and metrics. So the better the editorial policies and the higher standards for publication, the higher the metric. So let's compare two journals to illustrate this. Let's go back to my review paper that my colleagues and I published in Psychological Bulletin. This journal is one of the top peer-reviewed scientific journals in psychology. The journal impact factor over the last 2 years is over 17. Most journals are in the 1 or 2 range. Now, the 5-year impact factor is even higher at 28. The CITE score is almost 30, and the SJR score is over 10. Now let's look at a scholarly journal called the Journal of Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development, formerly known as the Journal of Child Custody. In August, this journal published a commentary on the Psychological Bulletin paper that I just showed you, 2.5 years after the original work was published. The time delay is important, and we will get to that in a moment. Now, there's not a journal impact factor for this journal. The CITE score is only 2.1 compared to Psychological Bulletin's 29.4, and the SJR score is only 0.2 compared to Psychological Bulletin's 10.72. Now, many of the opinions I have read by critics of parental alienation research are being published in scholarly journals with what I have seen to be low journal metrics like this, not scientific journals. And as somebody who has served on editorial boards for scientific journals with very high metrics, it's my opinion that the arguments made by critics about parental alienation research could not have been published in higher quality scientific journals. And the arguments made are often lacking empirical bases. They are often cherry picking one study and overlooking dozens of others that demonstrate the opposite point. They often fail to mention any research on parental alienation at all, or they categorically call it all junk science. And such opinions do not pass scientific standards of respected high quality journals, in my opinion. Now, what I've been seeing is a strategy to prevent scientific debate. I just gave you an example of the commentary that was published regarding my work, and I have several other colleagues who've encountered the same thing. And here's what happened to somebody I know recently. First, they published their paper in a peer-reviewed refereed journal. A critic of parental alienation then submits a commentary to the journal, and it's rejected because it doesn't meet scientific standards. Or the critic bypasses that avenue and sends it directly to a scholarly journal, sometimes years after the original work is published. The other journal's editorial standards are typically lower, as are the journal's quality metrics. The editorial board may also publish papers that align with their professional association's mission or their journal's mission and orientation, such as promoting an anti-parental alienation agenda. They accept the commentary. Now it's published as a standalone article, giving it the appearance that it's on the same level and quality as the first paper. Now, the authors of the original article noticed some major issues with the commentary. Statistics are misinterpreted. Statements are taken out of context. Straw man arguments are created to undermine confidence in the original study. Falsehoods are stated about the original work. What is the author of the original work to do? The commentary author violated standard scientific debate processes and has misrepresented their work. So they write a response to the scholarly journal editorial board. Rarely are they invited to comment. The editorial board rejects the commentary because it doesn't align with their beliefs. They do not allow the original authors to address the problems with the commentary. And when this happens, it makes it appear that the original work that was published in a journal with exceptionally high standards now lacks it. It serves to undermine confidence in the science and overemphasize opinions that are not scientifically valid enough to respond to the original work in the place it was published. The reader has now been deprived of a scientific debate, and a false debate is created. Even worse than this, I've seen critics of parental alienation research write their commentaries in internet blogs, which then other people cite as being valid scientific arguments against the original work. Now, in my opinion, this editorial practice is highly unethical, and it fuels perceptions that there are controversies in the field because opinion is being confused with evidence. These behaviors indicate to me that there's not a real desire for debate. These are strategies to undermine the scientific evidence. Another way that scientific debate happens is when scholars and scientists are invited to give talks or presentations, such as at conferences. These presentations allow for a direct dialogue between the originators of the work and the audience, and it can help to translate research into practice when this happens with a non-scientific audience. But this form of scientific debate has also been disrupted. For example, rather than invite scientists to a professional association to speak directly with members, the association leadership may hold a special panel event to translate what they believe to be most important for their members to know. These individuals are not peers or the type of peers who reviewed the original scientific work using the high standards that got the work published in the first place. The membership of the organization is then deprived of a direct dialogue or conversation with the originator of the work, and they are expected to accept the representative's opinions that were selected by the association as valid and as the final say on the matter. I believe this editorialization of a scientific work is making the science political and is contributing to a polarization in the field. I would not want to be patronized in this way by the leadership of any association that I'm a member of. Now, today we're seeing an increase in the amount of misinformation that's being published. The figure you see here is from a paper that my colleagues and I have under review, so I cannot give you a citation for it yet. The figure illustrates the accumulation of scientific evidence about parental alienation over time. The blue represents qualitative research on the topic, and the gray are the quantitative studies. Now, over the course of working on this project, I have read almost everything that's been written about parental alienation. And that's over 1,200 papers in 10 languages, translated, of course, because I'm not fluent in anything other than English. Now, I've read all the empirical studies that you see here and the opinion pieces published by critics of alienation. The empirical data on parental alienation is accumulating and rapidly, despite some critics still arguing that there's no scientific evidence at all. That statement is false. Now look at this figure, taken from a paper published in the American Journal of Family Therapy on the spread of misinformation about parental alienation. Dr. Burnett selected just one example of a false statement about parental alienation theory. He tracked articles that repeated this information and the number of them is increasing over time. And they're being published largely in scholarly, not scientific journals. Now, I don't believe that this increase in the spread of misinformation is a coincidence. It's been getting worse. Dr. Burnett also identified a pattern of authorship of people who've been spreading misinformation. And you can see in the citation down at the bottom of the screen, the article where these individuals are mentioned. He discussed people such as Jean Mercer, Robert Geffner, and Joan Meyer. He also found that one scholarly journal in particular, the Journal of Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development, had published a significant number of articles containing misinformation. And the editorial board of that journal contained people who also published misinformation about parental alienation in other scholarly outlets, such as Madeline Milchman, Linda C. Nielsen, and Joanna Silberg. Now, for more details, you can reference the paper that you see at the bottom of that screen. Now, scientists who study parental alienation, including myself, have faced ad hominem attacks on social media. We're accused of not being feminist, as protecting pedophiles. We've faced threats and have had to handle complaints to have us fired from our jobs. Here's a fairly recent ad hominem attack by The Court Said, which is an internet blog. The blog describes Professor Joan Meyer as having rebutted unprofessional attacks on her groundbreaking research. This blog rebuttal was published in January of 2021, and it did not appear anywhere else at the time. So it doesn't appear to have been a rebuttal written by Meyer herself or published anywhere else. So either it was written by Meyer herself, or it was provided to the blog to publish on her behalf. The unprofessional attack that's being alleged is referring to a peer-reviewed scientific paper that Dr. Lorandos and I published in December of 2020 in the journal Psychology, Public Policy, and Law, which is a high-tier forensic psychology journal published by the American Psychological Association. Our paper called to question a large number of problems with the study that Professor Meyer had published in a law paper series at her university, a series edited by law students, not peers. A careful read of our paper demonstrates that we did not attack Meyer herself. Our critique was of her work. One of the most professional ways to critique the work of another person is in a scientific journal. Our work passed a very stringent peer-reviewed process. The editorial board would not have allowed ad hominem attacks to have been published in the journal. For this blog to claim that our critique of Meyer's study was unprofessional, in my opinion, is an ad hominem attack on scientists like myself for simply trying to call out very serious methodological problems with someone's work. And this work is problematic because it's being used to change policy and laws about parental alienation. So these types of attacks are attempts to silence and bully scientists and undermine the scientific validity of the original work. A commentary about our critique of Meyer's work has yet to be accepted by the original journal. I see science denial techniques all over media coverage regarding domestic violence and parental alienation. When writing stories about parental alienation, conscientious scientific reporters have been told by their editors to get both sides of the story after they've interviewed many of the scientists working in this area. This has been referred to as the fairness doctrine, a practice that creates a fake debate and makes it appear to the public that there's more controversy over scientific issues than there is, such as with climate science. Doctors Brad Bushman and Craig Anderson are social psychologists like myself who've been studying the effects of media violence. They found that a lot of the scientific research on that topic was not getting media attention. They said, an attempt to get both sides of the story may itself lead to a final story that puts too little emphasis on the findings and opinions of leading researchers and puts too much emphasis on the few dissidents who could be found on any scientific issue. This fairness doctrine extends even to the public opinions of people who clearly have a monetary interest in befuddling the general public. Media coverage about parental alienation has not been much different than what Doctors Anderson and Bushman describe here. Over the last several years, there's been a focus in media articles, many of which are just op-ed pieces, about parental alienation being used by abusive fathers to continue abusing mothers and children. The authors often fail to interview scientists working in the area, and they feature problematic work of advocates who've not published in scientifically peer-reviewed journals. The constant theme is that women's claims of abuse are not being believed, and that they always should be, and that they're less likely to be believed if a father's claims have been alienated from the children by the mother. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that all women lie about being victims of domestic violence. I myself am a domestic violence survivor. What concerns me is the misuse of claims of abuse to obtain custody advantage, because false claims undermine protections for those of us who have been abused, whether they're male or female. Recent research published out of Australia provides additional evidence that a significant proportion of allegations of sexual abuse were not found to be genuine, and around a quarter were found to be deliberately misleading. The authors of these studies on the slide interpreted their findings as meaning that the courts were just not getting it, and that all women's allegations should have been believed. And yet the decision makers were the one with more evidence from both sides, something that these authors did not have to form that opinion. I'm also not saying that there is not gender-based violence. There is. However, the extent of this type of abuse in many parts of the world has been grossly exaggerated at the expense of failing to recognize other forms of abuse. Dr. John Archer, who's published numerous studies in top psychology journals about violence and gender, has found, using data from the United Kingdom, that both situational couple violence and coercively controlling abuse exist, and that women and men can be victims, and that we see cultural differences in this victimization. He found that in westernized countries, like those you see here in dark blue, the more empowered that women have become, and the more equality there has been between men and women, the less likely women are to experience victimization, along with there being slightly more male victimization. In a study published by the International Journal of Public Health, Dr. Costa and colleagues found across 6 European countries, Greece, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, and Hungary, female and male victimization of different forms of abuse were experienced at nearly the same levels, with very few sex differences were found. I'm also not saying that there are no parents out there who lie about being alienated from their children. Again, parental alienating behaviors and coercively controlling abuse are one and the same. Abusive people, no matter how they do it, manipulate and lie to maintain control and power. And if a parent can convince someone that they've been abused in some way, whether it's domestic violence or parental alienation, then they may try to use it to their advantage. So it's important to recognize, though, also that there's a lot of parents who don't even know that they're being alienated from their children. For example, in the 2019 paper I described earlier, we asked people whether they believed they were not the target of parental alienating behaviors. 220 people didn't think they were, but 87% of them actually were the target of 7 or more behaviors. So most people didn't label themselves as being targets, even though they were. To assume that all allegations of parental alienation are false is denying the reality that it happens. I believe it's hypocritical for people who have this assumption to then claim that all allegations of other forms of abuse need to be believed. Now, what this tells us is that we need to do a lot more education about all forms of family violence, and that parental alienation is a form of it. We're learning every day more and more about parental alienation using different methods, samples, and forms of measurement. Unfortunately, critics of parental alienation research have been pushing for legislation that promotes training legal and mental health professionals about coercively controlling abuse only. While there are many women who've experienced that form of abuse, and I'm one of them, and many of these women have had their children weaponized against them, there are many fathers who've experienced this as well. And the training that they're trying to promote is promoting a patriarchal, gender-based violence view of coercive controlling abuse, and is ignoring the experiences of many men. To only train people on one perspective presents a very warped and biased view that only benefits some women. It's a biased perspective, in my opinion, that also serves to protect coercively controlling mothers, because their alienating behaviors are branded as protective when they couple them with false allegations of abuse towards the father. The biased perspective leaves no room for male victims of female-only perpetrated abuse, and there's no recognition that about half of families where domestic violence has happened are situational couple violence. And the perspective fails to recognize the many families in which there's been findings of parental alienation and no other allegation of abuse has been made or found to have occurred. We can't allow decision makers to be trained on a distorted view of the world that is at odds with the scientific evidence and nationwide epidemiological data that I have not even had time to touch on today. The root of all of this, in my opinion, lies in a belief system about gender that denies women can be as violent as men. This belief system is immune to evidence. No matter how much empirical evidence accumulates, more resistance is bolstered against it. The threat of having their beliefs challenged motivates critics to attack the scientists and communicators of empirical evidence using any means necessary. Now, when Elizabeth Loftus received the William James Award, one of the most prestigious honors in the field of psychology, she described how critics of her work tried to silence her. She said, "Who, after all, benefits from my silence?" Science denial techniques are designed to silence people who challenge commonly held beliefs. One needs to wonder who benefits from the exclusive focus of women being the only victims of only one form of abuse. Who benefits from making us believe it's the only form of abuse that we should care about? None of us can be bullied into silence when there's injustice. So how do we combat this? First, try to read the original sources and evaluate them. Don't automatically trust blogs or professional associations' interpretations of the original work. Some articles are behind what we call a paywall, meaning that the journal charges you money to read them. Contact the original author. They can send the article directly to you without having to pay for it. Is there new empirical evidence that's written in the article or presented? Or are they just giving opinions? Are they just citing the opinions of other people who are just giving opinions? You can't just accumulate opinions and call that evidence. Look at the basis of the arguments that are being made in the article. What were the citations that are being used? Not all citations are the same. Some critics of parental alienation research have cited blogs as evidence, or biographies that were written by alienating parents and disbarred attorneys as evidence for their opinion, as if it was on the same par as a scientific journal. No, not all citations are the same. Or the person may not even provide any citations for the opinions that they're making. These are red flags. Evaluate the basis of the arguments by the author. And if you see that they're only citing opinions of others, they're failing to cite the scientific evidence for the topic, or they only cite critics' interpretations of the work, that's a problem. Be careful of where the paper is published. Is it a high-quality scientific journal? What are its metrics? What's the impact factor? What are the policies of the editorial board where that work is being published? Has the journal published proven falsehoods and misinformation about parental alienation? And if you're not a trained scientist, it can be sometimes hard to understand the scientific jargon and the methods and statistics that are being used, that are described in the papers. Please don't conclude that scientists are just trying to confuse and gaslight you. I have seen this when critics have read my articles and they don't like my conclusions because the data maybe threatens their perspective. They're not often scientists, so they may feel like the work was done and that's being communicated is gaslighting them. And that's not the case. You can contact the scientist directly with questions. You can also seek out information from other scientists with similar training as the authors and get their opinions. Now, scientists in the field of public health and climate science say that the only way to combat science denial is to publicly scrutinize it. I tried to start doing this today, and I'm sure I'm going to be facing even more ad hominem attacks for doing so. But we need to turn the spotlight on everywhere, and I hope others join me in doing this. And remember that in the defense of this gender bias about violence, critics of parental alienation will accuse scientists of doing the very thing that they are doing to project blame. Be critical of criticisms. And the ad hominem is a dead giveaway for much of this projection. What I've described takes a lot of work. To do all of this takes a lot of research and testing of multiple explanations for what you're reading. Many people don't want to do this, and they just accept what's told to them by others. And you don't even need to accept what I've shared with you today entirely. I've provided you with citations, and I could provide you with many more upon request for you to go to the original source and evaluate for yourself whether you agree with my opinion on what I've talked about today and what you maybe read from the original work. See whether my opinions are based on empirical evidence rather than just the opinions of others who I agree with. And then do this for the critics of parental alienation research as well. Again, this is a lot of work, but given what is at stake, our children, we all need to do as much work as we can. I want to thank you for your time today and bearing with me through the challenging world of research and all the problems and pitfalls and roadblocks that we face when we do it. If you'd like some more information about research and my research, you can visit my website that you see here. You can also contact me through my university where my public information is available. And I wish you all the best in our continued work to help children and families dealing with all forms of family conflict, particularly this very abusive family dynamic known as parental alienation. Thank you.